I call Louisa Wall.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare. I think this is the first opportunity I've had to congratulate you on your election as a Speaker in this House, and I look forward to working with you, and I hope you're enjoying your new role. As a member of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, I didn't have a chance to be part of the process that has brought this piece of legislation to this House at the third reading. So the Maritime Crimes Amendment Bill was a piece of legislation that was overseen by the last committee, and I'd like to acknowledge Mark Mitchell, who was the chairperson at that time, and he remains a member of the committee. This bill was referred on the 15th July 2016. It had 151 submissions and heard from 23 submitters. This is also the Honourable Winston Peters' first bill in this Parliament, so I'd like to acknowledge him. I found it quite interesting, kind of just reading the history of this piece of legislation, because essentially it's 2 of 16 international conventions related to terrorism and counter-terrorism. And when I look at the history of the agenda around terrorism and counter-terrorism, it actually goes back to 1934. And these are parts of the 2006 UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. So that's the context of this piece of legislation. We have a protocol that was updated in 2005 to the Rome Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against the Safety of Maritime Navigation. And I'll just focus on that for a bit, because I wanted to really understand the whole context of this law. And so I looked at maritime law, and it was very much about trade, and it was about the governing of the relationships between private entities that operate vessels on the oceans. And so initially it was really about commerce, and it was quite interesting looking at some of the particularly US politicians who were, I think they called them admiralty lawyers, and so they were involved in this sector because that was the industry that they came from. So it was about navigating, it was about salvaging, it was about shipping, sailors, but mostly it was about transportation of passengers and goods by sea. And this whole area was initially founded on an International Maritime Committee, which was founded in 1897, and they had responsibility for the drafting of numerous international conventions, including the Hague Rules. And then in 1958, that kind of morphed into the UN International Maritime Organisation, and their primary function was to prepare conventions such as the ones that we are debating tonight. So they call it the Sewer Convention, and my colleague Opito William Seal isn't in the House, but we're used to calling him Sewer, and then we had to call him Opito. So for me, this is the Sewer Bill, and I hope he appreciates that. It's quite a term of endearment. So this convention was adopted at an international, the Sewer Convention. So you had the protocol and then the convention, and it was adopted in Rome on the 10th of March 1988. And then the protocol, which is what we are in fact passing in the House tonight, the enactment of this bill will enable New Zealand to ratify the 2005 protocol. And that protocol, its full title is the Rome Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation. Now, what does this all mean? Well, what it actually means is the fact that ships will be designated a weapon of terrorism. And it also criminalises the use of ships who transfer or discharge biological, chemical or nuclear weapons. And the other substances that are noted are discharges that have got oil in them, liquefied gas, radioactive material, hazardous or noxious substances that can lead to death, serious injury or damage. And then the second convention that we're looking at is the protocol for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of fixed platforms located on the continental shelf. Now, these ones I had to have a look up. So these are about the prohibition and punishing behaviour which threatens the safety of offshore, for example, fixed platforms, including oil platforms. And it's the same thing. It criminalises the use of fixed platforms to discharge those things that I've read out, biological, chemical or nuclear weapons, oil, liquefied gas, radioactive materials, etc. Now, what I found really interesting in the process of this bill going through the House is some of the amendments that the Select Committee made, and I'd like to focus on two in particular. One is around protest activity, and I think it's quite significant to focus on protest activity because the Select Committee, I think, did a great job in differentiating between Greenpeace, for example, who have a ship, and they end up in situations where possibly there's a discharge of oil, liquefied gas, etc., etc. But what they said was that this bill is not intended to criminalise peaceful protest. And I think that's really significant, actually, because there could have been an ability, if Greenpeace, for example, ended up engaging in a situation where, for whatever reason, oil was discharged, that they could have possibly been caught under the ambit of this legislation. So to avoid doubt, the Select Committee, through their deliberations, were really clear that a peaceful act of protest or industrial action would not be by itself a sufficient basis for criminal liability under the Act. And there's a relationship between protest activity, which is contained in the Select Committee report, and clarification of requirement for intent. So the Select Committee was also really clear that they didn't want to make an offence where, as I've just outlined, there may be a ship on a protest that, just say it collided with another ship and somebody was seriously injured or that it caused damage. What they were saying is that that had to be the intent of the action. And obviously, when people are protesting in certain circumstances, they're not doing it to crash or to cause damage. What they're actually doing is highlighting a particular political issue or a point. And so, from my perspective and that of the Select Committees, it was really important for us to protect the integrity of those who use protest as a political discourse. And for the Select Committee to actually distill from those submissions that particular point, I think we should be really proud about, because our democracy functions when people have the ability to have their say, and the people who end up on vessels such as Greenpeace who go out into the middle of the ocean, I've got to say I've got a lot of admiration for them, because they are people who believe in what they're doing and they're incredibly passionate. So I think that this is a piece of legislation, although the opposition are kind of, I think there's huge merit in it, and for us to prioritise it shouldn't be something that we dispel or criticise, because this needs to happen. We, in doing this, will become, I think it's the 41st country in the world to actually ratify these 2005 protocols, and that's quite significant, because let's remember what the context of this piece of legislation is. It is to ensure that the international conventions related to terrorism and counter-terrorism that are part of our global agenda that New Zealand now has ratified. And so that means we join, I actually haven't looked who the other 40 countries are. Maybe somebody else could look at that in a future call. But it means we're one of the leaders, I believe, in the world, across all the other nations, in doing everything that we can in the protection and promotion of peace. Because fundamentally, conventions like this are actually about peace. And so it's been my pleasure to speak in this, the third reading of this piece of legislation, and I commend this bill to the House. Kia ora.
Speaker.
I call Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Delighted to